Hi everyone, welcome to the first day of content for CPUSH Term 4. As you can see on the screen, our first unit is going to be the Cold War. If you're interested or you're going to do some reading in the textbook, I just wanted to let you know that that includes chapters 15, 16, 17, and 19. We'll do a little bit of jumping around between these three chapters, and then they'll come back in the next unit. But the other thing I just want to point out is 18 is missing here, and that's because it will be the majority of what we talk about in the next unit. All right, let's jump into it. This is the short list that you've already seen if you watched the intro video. So just some things that you might do to expand your learning for the Cold War, or dig a little bit deeper. I tried to hyperlink either the things that I thought might be harder to find, or just to kind of help you out. I'm going to strongly suggest you kind of go over here. I think these are some really interesting things that you might like. The other thing that I don't have on this list, and I should, is the James Bond films. Not the ones from the 2000s, sorry, but anything older than that is going to essentially be the Hollywood version of the Cold War. So you might kind of check those guys out. All right, so this is the same thing for Vietnam. And again, if you listen to my intro video, I pointed out that these guys right here are going to be pretty dang good. But they are all rated R for some violence and some very colorful language. So really think about whether those are some good options for you. All right, on the bottom, you can't see it, but it says music. The Vietnam era is known for all of its music. So much good music at this time. However, a lot of it is anti-war music. Very many artists use their art form to kind of stand up against what they saw as an unjust war, which we'll get into. If you are looking for some music prior to when we get to Vietnam, let me know. I can give you a more complete or an actual list. If not, we will listen to, or I'll point out some examples when we get there. Oops. All right, this guy right here, our cheat sheet for the president and the amendments. We obviously don't have our Energizer notebooks, but I'm going to strongly suggest you kind of either take a picture of this or kind of jot these guys down, because I think it will really help you understand what's going on if you're thinking about where we see leadership change throughout this term. So on this cheat sheet, you're going to see I highlighted all of the Democratic presidents in blue and all of the Republicans in red. What those parties stand for are important when we talk about leadership change. So sometimes I think it just helps to kind of see that. The other thing that I did was all of these guys in green, and I actually forgot one should be Truman as well, are presidents that either didn't finish their term or had to finish somebody else's term. So, for example, again, Truman should be green, but he's going to take over after FDR gets assassinated. So he's going to finish FDR's term and then win on his own. With JFK, he's going to get assassinated, so he only serves 2 years. And then Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, is going to take over. He's going to finish Kennedy's term and then serve 1 term on his own that he gets elected for. Nixon is going to win 1 term, serve that term, and then he's going to win his reelection. But he actually gets involved in a pretty massive scandal, and so he's going to have to resign. He's our only president to resign, which we'll get to, but he's going to leave office here. Ford is going to have to take over for Nixon. Unfortunately for Ford, though, he only finishes Nixon's term, and then he never actually gets elected by himself. So he's just going to serve, 3 years, or part of 3 years. Okay? The other thing, just a reminder, we elect presidents in even years. For example, this is an election year. But they take over in odd years if it's a normal one. So let's go ahead and look at Eisenhower. Nothing funky happened with him. And we'll see that he's going to get elected in 52, but he'll take over in January of 53. All right, on our amendments. This is review. We actually talked about this last term. But just a reminder, the presidents can serve either 2 terms or 10 years. That's kind of strange if you think about a term is 4 years. But this is essentially so that a president could serve 2 terms and then the remainder of somebody else's. So, for example, technically, Johnson could have served the last 2 years of Kennedy's term and then 2 terms on his own. Okay? All right. 23. Washington, D.C. is our capital, but for a very long time, they actually could not vote in the presidential election. And so this gives them, the citizens of D.C., the ability to actually vote. Strange. Okay? Amendment 24 is really going to come up in the next unit, but just so you have it here, it's going to get rid of poll taxes. So in certain states, one of the ways to make it harder for people to vote is to put a tax. So they have to pay a fee in order to vote. So this is going to get rid of that. Unfortunately, this is only for federal elections, so just for people who are voting for president or representative. So we're going to see that in the next unit, there's going to be a lot of activism to try and expand or protect people's voting rights. All right, 25 is presidential succession. So this is essentially, what if the president dies? Who's next in line, and kind of how that works. So we know that if the president dies, it's the VP, and then you kind of go down that list. It's quite a long list. Okay? The person that is, let's see, third in line, so something happens to the president, the VP, the next person is the Secretary of State. That's wrong. It is the Speaker of the House. Wow. And so for us right now, that is Nancy Pelosi, who is a Democrat from California. So it's unlikely to happen, but just in case we went that far down the line right now, that's who would take over. All right, 26. This is going to lower the voting age. Again, remember that suffrage means voting, to 18. And this is a really big deal that we'll get to because it's going to lower the voting age in the middle of the Vietnam War. And we're going to see that lots of young people are strongly against the war. So this is going to have some consequences, or people think that this is going to have some consequences. Okay. All right, and then the very last one is the last amendment ever added to the Constitution as far as right now. And this happens in the early 90s. So what, almost 30 years ago. Okay. And this is essentially Congress can give themselves a raise. If you look at the actual text, it says something like Congress can't give themselves a raise, but really what this is saying is that they can vote to give themselves a raise, but it doesn't take into effect, or doesn't happen until the following term or the following session. So for example, Nancy Pelosi and the rest of the House can vote to give themselves a raise right now, but it wouldn't take into effect, it wouldn't happen until the next session. The reason for that is because if we as Americans are really mad that they've given themselves a raise, we can vote them all out. So it's kind of a check on Congress's ability to give themselves a raise. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. All right, so just a couple of reminders if we're thinking about how government works for this term, or really in general, but just kind of they're going to come into play in this term in this unit. So number one, what are the roles of the branches of government? So important, you might jot this down. Legislative branch, they are going to make laws, okay? They are the ones that are going to make the laws. They need the president most of the time to approve them, but they themselves are going to be the ones that write them. It is the executive branch, which includes the president, to enforce laws. So he or she is going to enforce them. That's going to be a problem if there are laws that the president or the executive branch decides that they don't want to enforce. All right, then the last branch is the judicial branch. And for us, that's really going to be a focus on the Supreme Court. And it is their job to decide if something is constitutional, to essentially judge those laws. Is this something that the government should do? Or what is it that this law actually means in reality? Okay. All right, how do we make an amendment? So in order to make an amendment, you need two parts. Number one, you need support from Congress. You need Congress to ratify an amendment. And then you also need the states to approve it. You need 2/3 of the states to approve it. And that will become important when we talk about a couple of amendments this term. But just a reminder that it takes not just Congress, but not just the states, but you actually need both of them to make that happen. All right, and then who declares war? It is actually Congress's responsibility to declare war. We're going to see during this term that Congress is going to give some of that power to the president and then kind of take some of it back. And so there's kind of a weird relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. But according to the Constitution, it is the legislative branch, it is Congress that has the power to declare war. All right. So normally in this term, we would start with the atomic bombing of Japan. And we would do a debate. clearly that's not how things are going to go this term. So I'm just going to briefly go over a couple of things because I think the atomic bombing of Japan that ends World War II is a really good bridge for getting us to the Cold War. Okay. All right. So I have a quote over here. It says, "Never inflict upon another major military power a policy which would cause you yourself to go to war unless you are fully prepared to engage that power militarily." So really thinking about what are the consequences of using a weapon this large, and what would be the response if somebody did that to us. All right, so a little bit of review, kind of bringing us from the end of last term or World War II to kind of where we are right now. So the U.S. had been neutral in World War II until Pearl Harbor in 1941, which will bring this in. Hopefully you remember, though, President Roosevelt very much knew that we were going to get involved in the war and was very much planning on us getting into war, even though we don't officially join until 1941. All right, he had been our president through the Great Depression and World War II. So he'd served, he elected 4 times, but serves 12 years. And so he is very important to Americans, and he kind of helps bring them through not only the Great Depression, but the majority of World War II. He's going to die in 1945, right before the end of World War II, right before the fighting ends in Europe, for sure, just weeks before that. But we still have to fight in the Pacific, or the United States still has to win the war in the Pacific. Okay, and so it's going to be Truman that's going to take over. Okay, but before that, this is something that's not talked a whole lot about. I don't know what's going on with my indentation right there. But FDR is actually going to beg Russia or Stalin earlier in the war to help in the Pacific when the fight in Europe is over. So at one of their earlier conferences, this is something that FDR is like, we're going to need help fighting. We absolutely need you. Will you please, please, please do this? And reluctantly, Russia will agree. And we'll see when FDR dies and Truman takes over, things are going to drastically change. All right, so Truman's going to take over. And his first kind of meeting with the major leaders is this Potsdam Conference. And at this, Truman actually tells Stalin that we have atomic weapons and that they've been tested. Stalin says, oh, interesting. Really, Stalin already knew. He already had spies in the United States that was aware of Americans' nuclear weapons. At the same conference, Truman is going to issue an ultimatum, or the United States is going to issue an ultimatum for Japan. Surrender now or else. He's not telling them what that or else is, but we know that actually means, or what he's really talking about is the atomic bombs. Okay? The other thing is Truman's going to switch. He does not want Russia's help in the Pacific. He does not want them to get involved. He doesn't want them to invade. He wants to get us out of there as quick as possible without Russia's help, which is going to be an issue because FDR is begging Russia over here, and then over here, Truman's like, no, stay out. Okay? The other thing that's going to complicate this is in this moment, Japan is not talking to the United States, but they're actually secretly asking Russia for help to kind of negotiate a peace deal. And Russia's not saying anything. They don't tell Truman over here that Russia is looking for that. And Russia sure as heck is not telling Japan that the United States has nuclear weapons. Okay, so kind of in this, where people or these world powers are talking to each other, but not fully telling each other all these things, the United States is going to drop the first atomic weapon, Little Boy, on August 6th. Okay? So the first nuclear weapon ever used on people. Okay? In the meantime, after this happens, Russia is going to invade Manchuria. Okay? So even though they know that Japan's trying to get out of the war, they're going to try to take advantage of this opportunity after the U.S. drops this, okay, to invade Manchuria. Okay? Again, the U.S. does not want them involved. We don't hear from Japan, we don't hear from Japan in the meantime, as Japan's trying to figure out what they're doing. Okay? And again, Russia's not saying that they've been asking for help. So we drop a second atomic bomb. We're going to drop Fat Man on August 9th. And we'll get an official surrender from Japan on August 14th or 15th. You see it both days, depending on time zones. Okay? All right, so because these atomic bombs are going to force Japan to surrender, the U.S. is actually going to call themselves or force Japan to accept that the United States is their supreme commander in the aftermath. And they're going to put General MacArthur in charge. All right. So you guys know I love documents. You also know that I can't make you do a whole bunch of documents from afar, so you're welcome. But there will be a couple every now and then I kind of bring in. And so I think this is actually a really important quote to kind of show you what's going on. And so this is a nuclear physicist, and he's talking about a meeting that he had with this guy named Burns, right? And so his recollection of what's happening. And so he says the question of whether the bomb should be used in the war against Japan came up for discussion. Mr. Burns did not argue that it was necessary to use the bomb against the cities of Japan in order to win the war. He knew at that time, as the rest of the government knew, that Japan was essentially defeated and we could win the war in another 6 months. At that time, he was much more concerned about the spreading of Russian influence in Europe. His concern about Russia I fully shared, but his view that our possessing and demonstrating the bomb would make Russia more manageable in Europe I was not able to share. Indeed, I could hardly imagine any premise more false and disastrous upon which to base our policy, and I was dismayed when a few weeks later I learned that he was to be our Secretary of State. And I think this is really important because what this nuclear physicist is talking about or showing is our main concern at that moment was actually not Japan. We knew we could defeat Japan. It might take us a little bit longer, but we weren't worried about that. What we were worried about was Russia. And so this idea that we used 2 nuclear bombs that killed hundreds of thousands of people to send Russia a message is very concerning. We killed hundreds of thousands of people, Japanese people, when at that moment, what we're really thinking about as our major concern or our major enemy is really Russia. So what we're seeing is that even before World War II is done, we are setting the groundwork for the Cold War. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop right here for a second, and I'm actually going to show you the trailer of Mean Girls. And I want you to think about what in the world could Mean Girls possibly be or have to do with the Cold War.
We have a new student with us. She just moved here from Africa.
Welcome. I'm from Michigan.
Great. I'm 16. Until today, I was homeschooled. And then it was goodbye, Africa. And hello, high school. Hi, I'm Katie.
I'm Janice. This is Damien.
Watch out, new meat coming through.
This map shows the school's central nervous system, the cafeteria.
You got your cool Asians, burnouts, jocks, the greatest people you will ever meet, and the worst.
So you've never been to a real school before? Shut up. Shut up.
I didn't say anything. Plastics. Who are the plastics?
They're teen royalty.
That's Karen Smith.
She is one of the dumbest girls you will ever meet.
I'm kind of psychic.
Really?
It's like I have ESPN or something. Gretchen Wieners.
She has 2 Fendi purses and a silver Lexus.
An evil takes a human form in Regina George. She knows everything about everyone.
That's why her hair is so big. It's full of secrets.
We want to invite you to have lunch with us. Regina seems sweet.
Get in, loser. We're going shopping.
Your house is really nice.
I know, right?
Being with the plastics was like leaving the actual world and entering girl world.
Have you seen any guys that you think are cute yet?
There's this guy in my calculus class. His name's Aaron Samuel.
No. That's Regina's ex-boyfriend. Ex-boyfriends are off limits. I mean, that's just like the rules of feminism.
Gretchen told me that you like Aaron Samuels. I could talk to him for you if you want.
Really? You would do that?
You're so hot.
Why would she do that?
She's a life ruiner.
I knew how this would be settled in the animal world. But this was girl world. All the fighting had to be sneaky.
I want to lose 3 pounds.
They're these nutrition bars my mom uses to lose weight.
It won't close.
It's a 5. You could try Sears.
Why are you eating a Caltine bar?
What?
They make you gain weight like crazy.
Who does she think she is?
I like invented her.
I'm sorry I laughed at you.
I'm sorry I called you fat.
I'm sorry that people are so jealous of me, but I can't help it that I'm popular.
Walk it off! Walk it off!
You know who's looking fine tonight? Seth Mosikowski. He's your cousin. What? He's a good kisser.
All right, there you go. There is this ridiculous video. Okay, so again, you guys are probably like, Miss Dietrich is crazy. Why in the world is she showing us this ridiculous clip? And so, besides the fact that Just Mean Girls is one of my favorite movies, Mean Girls is a really good thing to think about with the Cold War because you have this proxy war. The two main characters in Mean Girls never actually fight each other. They essentially have these proxies or these minions behind the scenes that are doing a lot of the fighting for them, or they are trying to essentially sabotage each other without doing that in person. And what we'll see is that the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union are going to do a lot of the same things in the Cold War. All right. So our essential questions for this unit, two of them, okay? Post-war, post-World War II, what is America's role in the world? And how is their role going to change? And what does that mean for the world as a whole? Right? And then what does freedom mean to Americans? We talk a lot about freedom being an essential part of America or an ideal that we are very strongly wedded to. But what that means, what freedom means, is going to change. It's also not going to mean the same thing for all people, and that's going to kind of set up some of the showdowns, essentially, between people in this unit. All right, so some ideology. These are going to be really important for this unit, really this term, because under this Cold War era that really lasts almost 45 years, communism is going to be this evil that America is very much focused on. But it's important to understand, like, what actually is communism, right? Or what are these things that America is going to fight against or fight for, okay? So these are all ideologies, okay? So these are their pure form. It doesn't mean that they, in reality, work exactly the way that these definitions make them seem like. All right, but let's start with communism. So this is a political theory, and it's based on community ownership of all property, shared by all according to the needs of each. And the government's going to control the means of production. How things are made, who's making them, who has access to them. We see that this is a combination between economic and political ideology. Right? This is essentially government controlling people's access to things. We, throughout history, have really seen that this has been paired with evil dictators, the Stalins of the world, the Maos of the world, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to have that. We've never seen it in its pure form, and we've never seen it in a democracy, but it could happen, right? This is just an ideology. Okay? All right, so what we are more familiar with is democracy, okay, which is what we supposedly have in the United States, okay? So this is a system of government by the whole population or the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. So a representative democracy. So for us, we don't have a direct democracy where we vote on every single thing. And that actually sounds like a nightmare in a country of more than 300 million people, right? But what we do is we vote for representatives who make decisions for us, so that representative democracy. But we are all supposed to be representative. Okay? All right. And then capitalism. Capitalism is not a political ideology, it's economic. Okay? We think that this is very tied to the United States, we meaning general America. But it's an economic system in which a country's industry or goods are owned by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So private rather than by the state, which you would see in communism. Okay, so we might think about supply and demand. In the United States, we have a mixed capitalist system. So it's not purely capitalism, but I can give you some examples of that. So things like public school. Okay, we use taxpayer dollars to fund education, public roads, a military, all those sort of things. If it was purely capitalistic, we would have private roads, private schools, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not on here, but the thing that's in the middle between pure capitalism and communism is socialism. And so what we see is that the United States is somewhere between a purely capitalistic society and a purely communist society. There's some elements of socialism within the United States. And socialism is really the idea that there are inequalities that exist, and the government should step in to deal with those inequalities. Okay? So, for example, we hopefully all agree that school is a public good, that we should all have access to good schooling. And so we're going to see within the United States, because we are a mixed capitalist society, we're going to take a little bit of that element of socialism and use it for providing this public good, that the United States is going to, or the government is going to step in to do that. Right? So we kind of see this spectrum. Okay? All right. But for the United States, we are very wedded to this idea that we are a capitalist society and communism is bad. Absolutely, absolutely. Particularly in the Cold War, communism is like a bad word. And when in doubt, the answer of what is wrong is communism, or the threat of communism in this unit. Okay? And the reason that America is going to think that it hates communism so much is this idea that the government is telling us what to do or how much we can have or how much we can charge for something seems to be the opposite of these ideas that we are wedded to, like independence or valuing hard work. So a really silly example of communism is perhaps you're a garbage man and your doctor makes the same amount of money. For many Americans, we're going to have strong feelings about that. And, a doctor goes to so much schooling, they work so hard, they're very valued. Why should they make the same amount of money as the garbage man? So under that idea, Americans are going to have a hard time with communism. We also think that if you work hard, that you can achieve the American dream. That if you work really hard, you can pull yourself up and make something of yourself. And that you as an independent person should be able to do that. So in communism, people very much feel like the government is telling you what, when, where, why, how, all those things, and it's out of your control. And we very much feel like we should have the freedom and the independence to make our own decisions. It's much more complicated than that, but that's kind of a way that hopefully helps you understand why so many Americans are going to be afraid of communism. All right. However, these questions about capitalism, and how that works and independence and those sort of things might be really good questions to be thinking about for ourselves right now. We are in the middle of a pandemic. And so how do we help people through something like a pandemic? Okay? If we think about kind of the tenets of capitalism, is like those who work hard succeed. And if you don't work hard, too bad. We're kind of seeing the evils of that right now if we think about how many people who have lost their job because we are in a shelter in place, that the government has said or recommended that we all stay home. So those restaurants, those small businesses, all of those different kind of things, it's not because those people didn't work hard, it's because of something else. So what do we do in that circumstance? And you're seeing the government do some really interesting things. They're talking about giving stimulus checks to people. They're talking about extending unemployment. And all these different things. Things that people have strong feelings about when we are not in a pandemic. But right now, we recognize that we need to help these people because it is of no fault of their own that we are dealing with the pandemic, right? It's not a restaurant's fault that they've said that we can't go out to eat right now. Okay? Or it's not a small gift shop's fault that people can't go out and buy things. It's something very different than that. All right. So, oops. All right, so I'm actually going to stop here because I'm going to make a very strong suggestion. Again, I can't check that you did this or not. They think it's very valuable for you to take a second and to watch Crash Course. If we were in class together, these are the questions that you would be answering. You don't have to write them down. I will kind of come back and maybe point out a couple of things the next time or in the next lecture. But I think that this particular crash course does a really good job of kind of connecting some of these ideas and giving you kind of a basic understanding of what happens. And kind of the big questions that the United States is wrestling with, right? So maybe think about jotting down some answers to these things or kind of watching this crash course and seeing if you can find the answers to some of these things. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Thank you for watching. Email me if you have any questions. You can always get me on Remind as well. And I look forward to talking to you guys in the near future.